Life is a series of circumstances and situations. And to a great extent, I'll think you'll be hearing more about Darby Ryan and his circumstances and his situations that created his environment, his world, and the remembrances that he provided us with. And I just want to give you a little bit of background because I think it's important to understand how this all came about. And its circumstance and situation, and it's like many things in life, accidents happen when you least expect it. Now, some of you might know, and some of you that don't know, my sister and I were both very fortunate in the fact that we got to come back to Ireland in 1955 when we were 10 years old. My mother decided it was a safer place for us in Bansha than it was in New York City. We were sent over on a plane and we spent our summers here growing up. So coming here, I was exposed to Bansha, Tipperary in Ireland, and we never forgot it. And my sister and I have been coming back all of our lives. So as a result, we were here in Bansha, and unfortunately the family, for a variety of reasons, which I won't go into right now, but I'm sure you're all aware of, as siblings passed along, as siblings passed away, and there was no family to take over the business, that's literally what happened to the Grogans. My Aunt Rena and Johnny had no children. They were the last ones in the shop in the Glen Bar, and once they were gone, there were no more family. So as a result, my sister and I spent the rest of our time in North Tipperary, up around Templeneiry and Bursley, where my mother was from. But we never, ever came to Ireland without coming back to visit the grave sites. And a year and a half ago, my sister and I were here. We visited the gravesite, and we were aware of Darby Ryan, but he wasn't, to be very candid, I'm being very honest, we were aware of him, but not in any significant manner. We were closer to our aunt and uncles, we were closer to our grandparents who were buried in the other site. We happened to walk over here and we saw the condition of this headstone. And the reality was that it struck us because we were going to make arrangements to have the headstone where our family is buried fixed. And my sister said, why don't we see about fixing Darby's headstone? And the person who deserves the credit for all of this is my twin sister. But she doesn't like to speak as much as I do, so she lets me do the talking. So the result was she Googled and she found Wally Costigan down in Care. We met with Wally, we arranged, and we had this put together. In the meantime, while we were here, we picked up 2 books. One about the Glen of Aherlow and famous people from the Glen by Martin Quinn. My sister sent an email to Martin Quinn, which started a chain of events that created this tonight. He thanked her for recognizing 2 of her family members in his books. He wrote back and said, thank you, da-da-da-da-da. If you're ever in Ireland. She says, oh, by the way, my brother is going back. He turns around and meets me, and I'm sure some of you are aware of this. He subsequently wrote a newspaper article. Lo and behold, Mary Alice arrives with the team. And Mary Alice comes charging in and says, you're John Grogan, you've done this. And I said, yes, can we meet? All through email, all through electronic communication. Had never met Mary Alice, had never met Billy Morrissey, had never met anybody else. And we met here one Sunday afternoon, and they looked at this and they said, wow, this is amazing, this is fantastic. Do you have any thoughts about this? And I said, basically, next August, my sister and I would like to come back with some family members and have a remembrance. And actually 2 of our family members, our cousins from England, came here today to join us. And that was what it was going to be, 4 people. And look at what happened. And here we are. And because of the efforts of the committee, the efforts of the people involved, and if it wasn't for the seed that was planted by Martin, we wouldn't be here. And what's so important is that circumstances and situations create these things. So what I'd like to say is thank you very, very much. One thing I'd like to do, since Darby Ryan was a poet, poetry is very important, not only to Darby Ryan, but to me. And interestingly enough, Martin Quinn had written a poem about Darby Ryan since this all happened, and he shared it with my sister and I this week. He emailed it to us. He said, I was thinking about you, I was thinking about Darby Ryan, and he wrote this poem. So what I would like to do is end this part of the program, because we have more important people going to read you poetry and going to be more effective about what it is. But I wanted to share this because I feel it captures who Darby Ryan was, what his circumstances and what his situations were. The poem is called The Bard of Bansha. A poet, a bard, a teller of tales, a keeper of lines in the patriot way. Ballad of satire he often did show in troubled times near sweet Aherlow. Came back to Bansha from a priestly call for family needs when tragedy befalls. Tending the farm he would do each day and write a few lines before he would pray. The volunteers, the tithes, the struggles, the heroes, his writing and songs, the land and the peelers. At Matthews of Thomastown and at the Castle Grand, he read many books of his own native land. The men, the movements, his work as a scribe, no time to be lost for him to describe. The resistance of farmers to payments unjust, the cattle, the farm, in earning a small crust. From a protest meeting to jail he was sent, a term in Clonmel for failing to dissent. News of a peeler encountering a goat gave Darby the chance for the people to gloat. The poems of Ireland, her people and places, laments of the nation with all of its graces. A writer, a minstrel, a singer of verse, a box of snuff at his side with those to converse. Though many years passed, his poetry lives on, in song and in story, in yarns never gone. An anchor now marks the spot where he lays, a reminder of Darby and of great bygone days.
I'm tempted to say friends, Romans, countrymen, but I won't. John, I'm probably a surprise to you, but
Very much.
A few years ago we had street theatre here outside the walls mainly, and we dedicated the street theatre at the time to Darby Ryan, okay? And my little segment on Darby Ryan was to tell what you finished with, and that was the anchor, okay? Right. Now, I happened to speak to Wally Costigan today, and just to put it in context, he estimated that that headstone monument would in today's money cost 20,000 euros. That's what the people of Bansha thought of Darby Ryan. I suppose you hit the nail on the head. You organised the tidying up of this yourself and your sister, and you headed to Wally Costigan. You kept it tight, 3 people. And that's the nub of why there's an anchor on this headstone, I think. The people felt that something had to be done for Darby Ryan 50 years after his death. They held a meeting, they set up a committee, and then they gathered funds. And they must have gathered great funds to say that they could come up with this, but that's not the real story. The next thing was they had to source a proper monument, okay? So to source the monument, they had to do it. No Google Maps, they had no sat-nav, they had no internet, okay? So therefore, they had to head off and try and find somebody who would have a monument for Darby Ryan. Maybe they mixed up feathered and feathered on sea, but somewhere they got lost on the way. And they ended up in Wexford, but before they got to Wexford, man does not live on bread alone. They had to live on bread and water and alcohol, okay? By the time they got to Wexford, their energy maybe and their judgment had been depleted, but certainly their funds had been depleted, okay? So they couldn't spend as much as they wanted to spend on Darby Ryan's headstone. They had the best intentions in the world, mind. Now, they searched around, they came upon this great stonemason in Wexford, but he couldn't deal with him. He couldn't do it for what they had left of their resources. But he said, come out the back, here. I have a headstone out the back, and it belongs to a man. It was dedicated to a man that became lost at sea. He was a sailor, lost at sea, and they never came to collect it. The deal was done. The headstone had an anchor on it. And that's why here we are 50 miles from the sea probably, and Darby Ryan, our bard of Bansha and Ashgrove especially, has a headstone with an anchor on top of it. They brought it back to Bansha. Naturally, eventually, they all arrived back and they put it inside here on the grave. And like every story, there's always a fellow at the back who asked him, what in the name of God did you bring back a headstone with an anchor on it for Darby Ryan for? And the answer was brilliant in its own way. He said, sure isn't he anchored here?
The last thing I'd like to say before we go in is that I think it's testimony to Darby Ryan that 50 years after his death, no matter what the odyssey, no matter what the story, no matter what the circumstance, no matter what the situation, to think that the man who died in 1855, 50 years later in 1907, was remembered. And the fact that because circumstance and situation, 120 years later, we're here to remember the man. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope everybody can hear me okay. And you won't mind if I decide I can't stand for an hour, so if I do a little bit of sitting, because you get to a stage when standing isn't a great idea. When I get to about 2 hours, I think Nancy would probably tell me, no, it's not 2 hours. When I was asked to give this talk, I had to do some preparation because Darby's not a topic I knew very much about, and you may well conclude when I finish that he still doesn't know much about it, but however. Anyway, the year 1855 was a long time ago, obviously, very long time ago. But across that time, and it's, into 3 centuries, the commitment of his descendants to remember his name and celebrate his work. And that's an endeavour, of course, that continues with John Grogan and the others who are involved here today. And in fact, today's events are in the same vein as what happened on an early January day. It was a Friday evening in 1906, when descendants and interested individuals gathered in the home of Diarmuid Grogan from Ballydavid. And among the gathering, of course, lots of Grogans, Ashgrove, Bansha, Ardán, Coolgirth. But it was not just a meeting of Grogans, there were some other people there. And the decision was quickly made that the best idea was the erection of, quote, an appropriate tombstone with an inscription in Irish and English. And so to that end, a subscription list was opened, and William Grogan of Ashgrove was elected chair of the committee to see that it was all carried out. Richard and John Grogan from Bansha were elected joint treasurers, so they obviously expected a lot of money to pour in. And then Sean Grogan became secretary. And then the meeting ends, and there's a quote, amusing anecdotes of incidents in the life of the poet having been related by some of those present, the meeting was adjourned. And then the subscription list closed the following October. And I'm sure you all know there's a Paul Simon song, You Can Call Me Al, and there are lines from that. There were incidents and accidents, there were hints and allegations. Well, incidents and accidents, hints and allegations are really what we depend on when you're talking about Darby. It's really not the stuff of history. And I've called this talk Some Thoughts on Darby Ryan Versifier. It's certainly not a biography of him or anything. And maybe just to explain that, commemoration is something that's quite different from history. And over the last decade, I've talked about this a few times. And this is an exercise in commemoration. And commemoration is an engagement with the past through a very narrow lens. What you see is defined by familial or by community piety. History is an exploration of the past through evidence, knowing that context, of course, is everything. So what I have to say is the fruit of whatever research and thought I was able to give this topic. Actually, it appears for the moment that I'm kind of trapped in Bansha, not having actually ever been in this building before. One of the things I'm working on at the moment is a political study of John Cullinan, based on a collection of papers that have just become available. Prior to that, I think my again, it's always biographical, my interest in a Bansha character was Thomas St. George McCarthy, involved with the founding of the GA. I remember, that's a few years ago now, speaking and writing about him when he was remembered in his old school. Anyway, coming back to the title of this talk and being a little pedantic, I've called Darby a versifier, not a poet. And the reason is, by definition, a poet is in the business of exposing and exploring his own feelings. From Darby Ryan's work, the closest we get really to him and to his feelings and attitudes is there is a clear indication of profound political pessimism. But that's really not personal, it's just politics. And of course, in his lifetime, there was a lot to be pessimistic about. So I don't suppose we should be too surprised. Going on the evidence of the poems, we should be careful to remember that creativity, which is what the poems are, isn't biography. So, you can't read into the poems that this is an explanation of something in his life. That's a very difficult thing to do. Anyway, who was Darby Ryan? In the first collection of his work published a few years after his death, he's called Mr. Ger, as in Jeremiah O'Rian, of Ashgrove, Bansha, commonly known as Darby Ryan the poet. So straight away there you have different identities. Well, Jeremiah is popularly Darby, but why O'Rian? Well, there is an English language O'Rian surname, and there was a family of that name in Bansha Castle, particularly William O'Rian, who, like Lloyd Ashe, conspicuously became Roman Catholic. And these were all figures central to Darby's own life. And of course, in Tipperary, O'Rian was seen as a posher version of the name. So maybe that's what Darby was doing. I don't know. Or it may be simply he was being influenced by the Irish version of the name. Now, there's an awful lot about his life that's beyond recovery. And as I say, we have to be careful about the tyranny of unsupported fact. For instance, that he was educated abroad, or that he accessed local big house libraries. I don't know what the evidence for that is. I suspect that this reference to abroad and the reference to the gentry, some things that are introduced to the biography to explain his level of education, which obviously was not ordinary. He had a fair measure of classical education. He didn't have to go abroad to get that. And if this is something that interests you, there was the life story of Thomas Gearan, who was a little later than Darby, but he was born in Aherlow in 1818, and there's a very comprehensive account of how he got his education, which was very substantial, and he did not have to go abroad. The association with Ashgrove then is the other thing, of course, that, always Darby Ryan of Ashgrove, very much part of his identity. The earliest reference we have are the Tithe Plotment records, which date from 1825, and of course they have been confusingly transcribed with their reference to Archgrove rather than Ashgrove. Now, there's a reference to Darby Ryan, just 7 names for that area, and he's listed as holding 30 acres, which of course would be Irish plantation acres. At that date, the occupant of Ashgrove House was Southwell Moore, the local big house, if you like, for him. 1837, John Henry Ashe married Moore's daughter, and he was a brother of the well-known and very odd Reverend Trevor Lloyd Ashe, who, as I say, is a figure that's absolutely central to Darby Ryan's life, and he was Darby's landlord. And it may be said, conspicuously missing from his works. And that's one of the things I'm pointing out here this evening. Given the kind of poet that Darby was, there was no better target for the kind of poems that he wrote than the Reverend, but he's conspicuously missing. I suspect that the reason is, of course, well, it wouldn't have been prudent to have peed against his landlord's front door, which is in effect what he would have been doing. We do get one very clear glimpse of, an interesting glimpse of Darby. In 2009, a specialist study by Padraig de Bruin was published by the School of Celtic Studies, based on the records of a Protestant evangelical organisation. Now, this is one of several efforts to persuade Catholics. It was episodic through the 19th century. You'd have a mad kind of enthusiastic dash to convert Catholics, and then it would die down, and then a new episode would arise. The particular society here was the Irish Society for Promoting the Education of the Native Irish through the medium of their own language. Just short title would be the Irish Society. Now, this was, of course, racist. I mean, they've no problem referring to the native Irish, their own language. And of course, it was an entirely proselytizing endeavor. And this one is forgotten because it's pre-famine, and so much that happened pre-famine is forgotten. Most famously, of course, there was a proselytizing exercise in Doon in County Limerick around 1850, which is very much not forgotten. As I say, these things went in waves. Now, in order to further their work, Irish-speaking local agents were needed because a lot of the population was Irish-speaking. It's pre-famine. The campaign in the 1820s was inspired by a mixture of evangelical Protestant zeal. This was a period when people took their religion very seriously. People totally committed to what was seen as, and what they called, the Second Reformation. Obviously, the first one was Luther back in 16th century. Well, this was going to be the second one. And there were also millenarian ideas, which are ideas about the second coming and the end of the world. It's very QAnon, if you follow kind of mad American politics. There's nothing new about those ideas either. So it's a mixture of those two things that were current in the 1820s. Now, during these years, you had campaign after campaign to persuade Catholics to change their religion. You'd had a Hibernian Bible Society, and again, the figures are quite startling. In 23 years, they managed to circulate 209,000 Bibles. You had a London Hibernian Society, you had a Sunday School Society, and then the one I like most, you had a Religious Tract and Book Society. And in 10 years, they distributed 4,400,000 tracts. Now, these are not Bibles, they're just pamphlets and leaflets. But you can see how seriously they're doing their work and how well they're funded from England. And so this was the group with which Darby was engaged. Now, regarding the provision of primary education, you had the Kildare Place Society and various other groups. And it was very difficult to get away from issues of religion and religious identity. As I say, people took all that thing very, very seriously at the time. Now, a key figure behind this particular proselytizing movement was Robert Daly, and he was later Bishop of Cashel from the 40s through to the 70s. At this stage, he wasn't bishop. He has an interesting local connection because his older brother was Lord Dunsandle, and it was that family that eventually owned Thomastown Castle towards the end of the 19th century. So they have that local link. Now, one of the organizations, this is the Irish Society that's going to do great work converting the local population. One of their key recruits was William Connor. And again, it's interesting, while Darby manages to become Darby O'Rian, Connor is obviously originally O'Connor, and he drops the O. So, they're changing their name for issues of identity, different identities, obviously, in each case. William Connor is the person whose evidence we have for meeting with Darby. He was temporarily based in Clonmel, and he was one of their key agents. He needed to recruit people to spread the word, so to speak. He was extremely well paid, £80 per annum, and expenses. And his own views very much committed to the movement. He held that the cure to Ireland's troubles lay in individual moral reformation, and that would be brought about by scriptural education. And that the central doctrines of Christianity, this is where his own beliefs, total human depravity and salvation by faith alone. And of course, since the Church of Rome didn't hold to those, he couldn't allow that it was even Christian. So these are very serious religious views. And so by 1824, of course, as often happens with these groups, he fell out with the organization and went off in his own way. But that's 24. He was still working for them in July 1823. And he and a friend went on a walking tour looking for and recruiting likely prospects for the society, people to work for the society. And his report to the society opened as follows: "Having turned my thoughts for some years to the state of the people among whom the providence of God had placed me, I very soon arrived at the firm conviction that a scriptural education was the only radical cure for their moral disorders." And then this is his meeting with Darby. We proceeded towards the Glen of Aherlow to a man of the name of Darby Ryan, who has a little farm on the bank of the river Aherlow. The day was excessively warm and our journey lay through the fields. We found Darby at home. He's a noted Irish scholar. We proposed during the plan of establishing Irish schools and conversed for a long time on the best and most effectual plan of proceeding. Indeed, the proposal was but made when he took fire. Though about 50 years of age, yet it seemed to restore him to youth. He's a very decent man, has a comfortable farm, and from his great influence will be exceedingly useful in all that part of the country. He took us to a schoolmaster who lives about 2 miles from his house, who's to have an Irish school. But as his scholars, and Darby is sure he will make up about 50, will be for the most part grown-up lads who would not, as he said, take to learning in any other way except through the medium of the Irish language. He must keep his Irish school at night and during the long evenings. And so next in the account is a reference to another well-known local scholar across the border in County Limerick. And so Conor is clearly certain of Darby's enthusiasm for the work, and that Darby is going to go off and recruit others. Now, so what's all this about? How do you interpret this? Well, there are different aspects, obviously. There's a recognition of the value of education. Nothing controversial about that. There's an enthusiasm for the Irish language. Fine. A willingness to earn money. Again, no problem with that. And then, of course, there's the tricky one. Cooperating with an endeavour to persuade family, friends, and neighbours of the error of their Catholic beliefs and to embrace the idea that God could only be found in the Bible. And as I say, first three I mentioned, no problem, but that's the tricky one. In any event, the source suggests that Darby had cut links with the Irish society by 1830-31. And a refusal to pay tithes at that stage, of course, there was a campaign not to pay tithes, but that's not a Protestant Catholic confrontation, so he could still be enthused about spreading the message from the Bible and fight against paying tithes. As I say, the Tithe War wasn't Catholic against Protestant, it was Church of Ireland against the rest. But, you know, at this distance in time, it's 200 years ago. All I can do, you know, give you the facts such as they are. How you interpret them, you know, it's difficult and will be influenced by your own attitudes and views. It is certainly the case that Darby Ryan and later his family kept the Bedell Bible, because it now was given very recently to Studies Library in Thurles. And that's dated 1830. So as part of his work, he was given this Bible. Now, Bedell is a famous figure because he's 17th century. He was English, but obviously had huge linguistic skills. Appears not to have had difficulty learning Irish, came over to Ireland, learned Irish, translated the Bible, was made Provost of Trinity and given an Irish bishopric. So it's his Bible. And Darby's descendant obviously treasured it, or at least they certainly kept it. And as I say, very recently it was given to the library in Thurles. Anyway, to put the matter in unmistakable terms, any kind of dalliance with the Irish society, its agenda and its Bibles, was incompatible with any expression of Irish nationalism. And so there's no point in putting a Trumpian spin on it. Up doesn't become down because you say so. So, you know, how you are going to interpret this episode in Darby's life is entirely up to you. I'm just giving you some of the source material, because there's not a lot of source material. Anyway, from Griffith's valuation, which dates in Tipperary to a few years before Darby's death, around 1850, we have some documentary evidence. The townland of Ashgrove, about 300 acres. The landlord was Trevor Lloyd Ash, again around 180 acres held by his brother. And with regard to the other tenants, well, Darby doesn't appear, but there are several Grogans. But at this stage, Darby is an old man. And so presumably he's living with some of them, but he personally doesn't surface. And again, to repeat a point, Darby is very much a poet of place and a commentator about events. But as I say, very reticent with regard to his own landlord. And, you know, there was an awful lot to be said about Trevor Lloyd Ash. He was a Catholic convert. He was in minor orders, hence the Reverend, buried in the grounds, literally a stone's throw. He's out in the grounds of the Roman Catholic Church, just on the right-hand side as you go into the church. He was a fanatic about not drinking alcohol. And he was a hugely enthusiastic supporter of Father Matthew. And he was tied up in an ongoing legal dispute, which kind of did for him mentally and every other way. And then he published a novel, which was published in 1844. The novel was basically a kind of therapy to work through all his issues, but because it's local, it's of interest. The title is The Attorney, you know, he couldn't get away from the legal stuff, or The Contrast, a descriptive tale illustrative of the advantages of teetotalism, both in its physiological and moral bearings on society at large, dedicated by special permission to the very Reverend Theobald Matthew by the Reverend Trevor Lloyd Ash of Castlemary, Ashgrove, formerly of St. Albans Hall, Oxford. Now, again, you can pass that. The St. Albans Hall, important to indicate to his readers that he had an Oxford education. And his address is this mad Gothic folly, Castlemary, which was built, and no sooner built than it fell down. again, there's an article I wrote recently in the Tipperary Historical Journal with an interesting illustration of Castlemary, if you're interested. So for a long time, obviously, with such a landlord, and as I say, what you have to understand is that there was, leaving aside immediate family, there was no more important relationship that you had at this time if you were a farmer than with your landlord. So this is absolutely crucial. And by this time, of course, the Ashe estate was in a lot of financial difficulty. And to the Reverend Trevor Lloyd Ashe's great relief, Charles Moore arrived. Charles Moore was a merchant from Liverpool, and he arrived to buy it in 1854, just before Darby died, which wouldn't have affected him, I mean, at that stage of his life, but that change of landlord would be hugely important for his family. As I said, no other relationship mattered more. And then, of course, he had lived through the famine, which was the other great change that had come. Assuming he was in Ashgrove during that time, just looking at population figures, lots of places would appear to have suffered far more. There is then another interesting reference. Okay, Darby died 1855. I came across a reference to his daughter. By the mid-60s, he had one daughter living. Perhaps another daughter, but one daughter living. And that was Nora, who was married to William O'Brien. And she appears at the Bansha Petty Sessions in 1866, and like district court, basically. And the local magistrates would have been Captain Massey Dawson, Ballinaccorty, and Francis Lowe from Kilshan, local landowners. Now, the case was an odd one and involved milk and pishogues. And you know enough about Ireland and its past to know those two went together very neatly. Kind of complicated, but basically there was an event in Glen Cushabinna on the 9th of June, 1866. And and each side was summoning the other. So on one side you had William O'Brien and the wife Nora, and on the other side you had somebody called Morgan Heaney and another man, a man called Keane. And I don't know the ins and outs of it, it's all about nothing, but basically there was a milk can involved. But there's one interesting phrase, and it clearly had to do with Heaney's accusation that Nora had put some kind of a hex on his cattle, and that he had found her and this is a quote, milked a spancel, S-P-A-N-C-E-L, opposite the well in Ballinaccorty. And anyway, his complaint was that from 6 cows, he had only got 2 firkins, which is about 70 pounds, and 32, so it's about 172 pounds of butter from his 6 cows. Now, I have no idea what you should get from 6 cows, but apparently that wasn't very good. And he was blaming Nora. Now, they're not judges, they're just the presiding magistrates. Massey Dawson basically told them to go home and have sense, which they did. But the final thing is there's a comment in the report, and you make of this what you will. William O'Brien's wife is the only daughter living of the late Darby Ryan. She has by no means a musical voice, which I think suggests she was something of a virago, but has a penchant for notoriety at Bansha Petty Sessions. So it would appear that that wasn't the first time they had her before. I don't know, but it was an odd comment to make. So just moving on to look at some of the work, which is why Darby, of course, is remembered. And I want to talk for a few minutes about, well, Peeler and the goat, and do something which is an interesting exercise and appears not to have been done before. It's obviously very famous, and it has its place. There's a famous collection of ballads called Songs of Irish Rebellion, put together by a Swiss scholar called George Zimmermann, published first in 1966. And it's kind of an accolade that Darby's, that's the one that's from Darby that's there, that's not really a surprise. Now, looking at the few accounts that are extant about Ryan's life, there are versions about the genesis of Peeler. And I think, we can agree, written about 1830. But I'd like to suggest an entirely different point of inception for the poem, and one for which there is actual evidence, and doesn't involve a lot of nonsense about goats, which is the kind of standard stuff it does involve. On Sunday, the 5th of July, 1829, 4 peelers stationed in Aherlow, having returned from bringing a prisoner to Mitchellstown, and pleased at having done their duty, and exhausted on that hot summer's day, well, they repaired to a pub, whereas the report will put it, they drank freely, as one does, On their way to their station, and in that station what stupid can appear eminently sensible, the men who were armed with rifles and bayonets, they came across some pigs, not goats, pigs, and thought it great sport to stab at the unfortunate animals. The owner of the pigs, not best pleased, remonstrated with the drunken policeman and was consequently assaulted in a most brutal manner. However, all of this was observed by a party of young lads who were gathered for a crossroads dance on that summer's day, and on seeing this as better sport, they laid into the Peelers. Now, the following year, The Peeler and the Goat appeared, written by Darby Ryan, and we can be certain that Ryan read a report of the encounter, and it doesn't seem too much to suggest that this was the seed of the epic. In this, he did what local versifiers always did: take a local incident and broaden its scope so that it conveys some universal truths. In this case, the conflict between law without justice and the individual strengthened by communal solidarity, which was at the heart of the Irish experience under British rule. So a great abstraction is reduced to a comic encounter between a peeler and a goat. Now, the first thing to be said about Peeler is that there's no canonical text, just a fancy term. There's no definitive text, which is a problem. And so the paradox is, while Darby Ryan wrote The Peeler and the Goat, which Peeler and the Goat did Darby write? I should repeat that, because it is the central paradox. While Darby Ryan wrote The Peeler and the Goat, which Peeler and the Goat did Darby write? So to illustrate this, I'm just going to do this with Peeler. I'm not going to do it, so you can relax. I'm not going to do it with any of the other poems or songs. So I'm just going to take 3 versions of Peeler and just kind of contrast them. Now, there are lots of ones I could have taken. I'm taking these 3 for particular reasons, because each is significant in its own way. One is from the Tipperary Minstrel, which is the collection of Darby's work that was published about 1860, just a few years after his death. And the second is the school's folklore collection, which is available online. And the third is from a collection called The Spirit of Tipperary. And obviously, the Tipperary Minstrel, doesn't need explaining why you would take that version. School's folklore, well, it's the 1930s. It's excellent with respect to Aherlow and Bansha in that area, because, again, how good the material there depend on the teachers and how committed and how involved and invested they were in the local community. So it's very good from this region. And the third is it's a collection of poems called The Spirit of Tipperary. It's not dated, but it's actually 1938 and just put together by 2 scholars. It's been out of date, out of print for years, but it actually was reprinted about 2 or 3 years ago. And the reason I'm taking that is that when they print the poem, they say specifically that this is the authentic version of the poem taken from the poet's manuscript. They don't give any more information than that, but that's what they're claiming this is the version. Now, I'm just going to go through it quickly, but I'm not noting minor things. These are kind of major things. I'm just going to take those 3 versions. I did mention the Zimmermann, this Swiss scholar. Now, the version he took it from a broadside, a ballad collection in the National Library. And you might be, again, it's interesting, in that version, you won't be pleased because it doesn't open with as Bansha Peelers and so on. It opens with a set of Peelers. So Bansha is neglected from the very first line. But I'm not looking at that. So the 3 I'm looking at, minstrel schools and the Spirit of Tipperary. Now, so I'll just go through the verses very quickly. This isn't going to take long, but it does illustrate the point about, which version. In the first verse, in the last line, the goat is threatened with New Zealand, but in the Schools and Spirit version, he's threatened with prison. Now, obviously, the specific is more powerful and it's a better reading. Which one did Darby write? I have no idea. In the second verse, 4th line, in Minstrel and Spirit, it's a croppy, whig, or torio, but in the Schools version, no reference to the croppy, which again is to miss out something, because that's a reference that would have resonated. And then, rather amusingly, this is still the second verse. In the last line, the goat reference is it's the rutting season. But the Schools version, of course, has to clean that up. And it's the ranting season. And in the Spirit, it's the milking season. Again, I'd like to think Darby probably wrote about the rutting one because he, kept the earth. And then in the third verse, the last line, there are odd changes. The peeler is threatened with transportation. And there's a reference to Grattan's Act, and in the schools one, it's Peeler's Act. They can't, whoever is writing it can't make up their mind. Neither actually makes sense. I mean, we understand about penal transportation. You were sent off to the colonies for 7 years, 14 years, or for life. And the legislation is 1790. It's not associated with Grattan. He'd be highly indignant to think it was. Peeler, yes. I mean, he was running the country. He wasn't responsible for the legislation, but he was chief secretary, and he had kind of founded the police in Cashel. But again, it's kind of odd. By the fourth verse, the changes become major, but the intent is the same. The goat speaks and proclaims his innocence and his faith in local justice. In the tip minstrel and in the spirit, this parish and this neighbourhood are both peaceful and tranquil. There's no disturbance here, I'm sure, and may it long continue so. But the school's version is, no penal laws have I transgressed by deed or combination. I have no certain place of rest or house or habitation. And then in the fifth verse, when the peeler states his case, in minstrel he claims to have found 2 long pikes which threaten me with fury. And in the spirit, the goat will be sent to Cashel for judgment. Now, in both of the versions, the compliant magistrate who's going to pass the judgment and send the goat to be transported to Australia is, quote unquote, Billy Purify. And he will sign the necessary documents sending the goat to Cork for speedy transportation. Now, William Purify is a real person. I've written about him in the Tip Journal. He died in 1846. He was from Greenfield in Capawhite, and notorious in his lifetime. He kept whores as feather pluckers when they weren't engaged in their other occupation. They were busy plucking feathers. So pretty notorious, but a real person, and would have no trouble sending people for transportation. But in the school's version, there's no specific magistrate mentioned. And again, the specific is always more effective and powerful than the general. But again, it's a mixing gathering, because instead of just Cork, it becomes Queenstown, which again is better. In the sixth verse, minstrel version begins, Ardan, it is my dwelling place where I was bred and born. But in contrast, the school's version is anemic. This district and its neighbourhood are peaceful. And again, the specific is always more powerful. And the minstrel version has a statement, if the goat had a shilling to buy poteen for the peeler, all would be forgotten. But the school's version declares that the goat will rely on an honest jury which will acquit him. And in the spirit, Bansha is my dwelling place where I was bred and born, oh, and so the peeler's threats are scorned. And then they don't even agree in the number of verses. It's 7, it's 8, it's 9. And I mean, you would think that would be something fairly basic. And then at the end, in the versions that have 9 verses, which helps to date the poem, it ends, our association, which was O'Connell's repeal association, and that's 1830-31, which would be a way of, but again, so I hope I've illustrated my point. I mean, everybody knows the peeler and the goat, but which one? What's needed is somebody which has been done with other writers and other poets, maybe more likely Irish language ones, to go through what's there and make head nor tail and see, can you get and draw up a proper kind of definitive canonical text. But it hasn't been done, and whether it will be done or not, I don't know. Not done because, kind of from a scholarly point of view, Darby probably would be seen as too popular. Anyway, looking at his life, of course, one is struck. There's an extraordinary amount of copy. I mentioned about the idea of being educated abroad, or he depending on big house libraries for classical references. So there's a lot of cutting and pasting, cloning, if you like, without going back to original text. A good example of that in the collection of material published in 1860-61 that was done to kind of honour Darby just a few years after his death. It includes Patrick Sheehan, which I remember having to learn when I was at school. My name is Patrick Sheehan, my years are 34. Tipperary is my native place, not far from Galtee Moor. I came of honest parents, but now they're lying low, and so on. And that's attributed in that collection to Darby. Unfortunately, of course, and there is proof that it isn't by him. It originally appeared 1857, and it was ascribed to somebody who was calling himself Darby Ryan Jr. And it was Charles Kickham, and he was simply paying homage, or kind of, but people then kind of took it up. And so it's in that collection. And that's the kind of thing, what is by Darby and what isn't. And even if you can settle that it is by him, what version? So it's quite difficult. On the issue of how his material was spread, I came across a piece written in 1914, and I'm not sure what the authority for this is, but it seems to me very plausible. And this is an account of how his work was spread. Just remember, all this is manuscript in its original form. Talking to neighbours after Sunday Mass, Darby would produce a piece of paper from a pocket and casually remarked that this was something he picked up during the week. He would never claim authorship as such. The paper would be read, appreciated, passed around, and copied. And the subject matter could be anything, something national, something local, didn't matter. So that seems to me quite plausible. The other thing is that if you look at the earlier printings of the Darby's work, there's very often a familiar tune, which is also terribly important in terms of transmission, that would go with the work. So really, in terms of spreading these poems or these ballads, the tune is really everything. Now, many years ago, 20, 25 years ago, I spent a summer in one of the libraries in Trinity College in Dublin researching the ballad collection of John Davis White, was an important figure in Cashel in the 19th century. He owned and edited the Cashel Gazette newspaper. He also worked for the diocese, the Church of Ireland diocese in Cashel, and very much a kind of antiquarian scholar. But one of the things, unusually for somebody of his background, he collected these ballads, and these ballads are called broadsides, and they would have been printed, written by whoever, Darby, for example, printed on very cheap paper, often with a kind of a badly done woodcut for illustration, and they'd be hawked around at fairs, maybe sold for a halfpenny. And dealing with, for example, a very popular topic would be some scandalous murder or something in the war or some battle. But the way you got the possible people to buy would be by singing. So the tune was terribly important. When the Tipperary Minster was published in 1861, it sold for 8p. So that's a version. It's not a broadside, which is a single sheet. But it's as badly printed as that, because cheap was the crucial thing. So Darby Ryan, one can compare him with somebody who came slightly later, and that's J.J. Finnan Miles, for whom a collection of his work was published, which is what Darby needs but didn't get, because the Finnan collection that was published just around the time he died is quite authoritative. Obviously, one doesn't know why the Peeler and the Goal had the appeal compared with every other. I don't know. I mean, how does anything become hugely successful and spread? It's very difficult to know. To go briefly through some of the other poems, I don't have any doubt that the best poem, the one that is the most substantial, it tells you a little bit about him personally, is a poem called Ireland's Lament, a poem. That's the title, Ireland's Lament, a poem. And it's an astonishing 47 verses, 9 lines each, so that's 423 lines. So it's a pretty kind of mammoth work. It tells us something, I think, about his politics. It's very pessimistic. At the beginning, he states the value of ancient ecclesiastical ruins, of which there were plenty around him. And they were just reminders of former glory. It wasn't ever necessarily going to come again. And he talks about this degenerate land. And he asks, the Geraldines are gone. He mentions all the people you'd expect him to mention, O'Neill and O'Donnell, the Battle of Clontarf, Emmet, kind of all the boxes are being ticked that you would expect. There are some wonderful lines in it. I think apart from the content being interesting, I think the style is interesting. Talking about Ireland, she wears proud Albion's chain and shrinks beneath her sword. And of course, there's a lot of the poem is given over to O'Connell. Insofar as we can judge what his politics were, he was an O'Connellite. It would have been very difficult for him to be anything else because his lifetime very much coincides with Daniel O'Connell's lifetime. And so a lot of the poem is given over to O'Connell. And again, it's interestingly and nicely written. He's talking about O'Connell. He's gone, the champion of his country's cause, the man whose deeds transcend all human praise. And then he has some references to William Smith O'Brien, which is coming up more to the time when he's writing the poem. I think one of the reasons for the pessimism in the poem, if it comes from the kind of around 1850, is the politics of that time, the Pope's brass band, people selling out in Parliament. There was a lot, as I said, to be pessimistic about. He talks about the famine, which, again, given his age, he was living through it as a mature adult. It had to have a profound impact on him. And again, the lines, the images are wonderful. He talks about Moloch's shrine. Moloch is one of these kind of Phoenician gods to whom there was human sacrifice. So it's a very powerful image. Shroudless and coffinless, they thickly lie. The famished dogs devour them in their graves. How much of that is, as I say, we should be careful about transposing this into biography, but one doesn't know what did he actually witness during the famine. He wasn't from a category of people who necessarily suffered during the famine, but he would have seen the suffering. And then, of course, emigration, just after the famine, just towards the end of his life, was in spate from the country. And again, I think a wonderful line, and thus they go, our hardy sons of toil, to find a briny grave or happier home. And then the last verse is very dark, that he talks about the cringing serfs and beggars they have made. Low in the dust our ancient shrines are laid. And then the last verse, how the poem ends. You have the standard female representation of Ireland, Hibernia. But in this case, she's cancerous. And he talks about the division in the country. One hates the altar where another kneels. And so it's profoundly pessimistic. So if you're interested in Darby and only going to look at one of his works, some of the others are entertaining and amusing, but the one with some substance and that might actually tell you something about him is this one. Now, I've emphasized the style in that poem. It's very well written, I think, in places. But he could write absolute crap, stylistically. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard of somebody called William McGonagall. William McGonagall is Scottish and very famous. He's 19th century. But he's famous because he's generally regarded as the world's worst poet in English. So there's a certain interest in him. I want to make a contrast with some of this when Darby was at his worst. This is a McGonagall. It's probably the one that's most often quoted from McGonagall. It's the poem about the new bridge that was built over the River Tay. Beautiful railway bridge of the silvery Tay, with your numerous arches and pillars in so grand array, and your central girders, which seem to the eye to almost towering to the sky, the greatest wonder of the day and a great beautification to the River Tay. So you can see his enthusiasm, but he's not. So Darby can reach that level at times. In Charade, this is a very long-winded title, by an old acquaintance addressed to Mr. Darby Ryan, Ashgrove, written from New York. And this is the first verse. Dear Darby, I'll ne'er forget Tipperary, where fun, fights and beauty are every day seen, and where often I danced to the tune Paddy Carey with my dear little Colleen on the fair green. Or this one, of fishing and poaching I was a true lover, and many cold winter oft measured the bogs. If failing to take down a wild duck or plover, I ne'er missed pop at the gamekeeper's dogs. Oh, this is from Dwyer's Stout Ale, written in 1852, so we're told, and it's very McGonagall-ish. Near the town of Sweet Tip, there's a neat village called Bansha, where you may go by rail. And then, anyway, you get the message. One of his poems, Dawson's Seat, is a puzzle for me. I can understand where he's going with the other poems. Dawson's Street, I'm not sure, as I say, it's a puzzle. He's talking about some landlord family, local, and they presumably, he's comparing them to Brian Bruce, so presumably there's an O'Brien connection there somewhere. But it's really over the top. He's a generous landlord. He's ample fortune among his neighbours, like a quick stream in profusion flows. He gives employment to needy creatures and means to purchase both food and clothes. He's a paragon. But then there are references to New Forest, which is a Massey Dawson reference. So it's kind of all over the place. And he ends the poem by being quite coy. These lines are void of exaggeration. To fulsome praises I ne'er was prone. I hate gross vulgar adulation. I did not kiss the smooth Blarney stone. I've travelled, roved o'er all this Irish nation in all its bearings from shore to shore, and to New Forest I saw none to equal brave Dawson's Seat. I'll say no more. So it's a puzzle. But the poem, I'm going to finish by one poem. That's a wonderful word, isn't it? I'm going to finish. Which I like a lot because you have to understand about Darby is that he escaped the Victorianization of the Irish Catholic Church, which is a kind of a late 19th century thing, when it became very prim and proper and prissy. And it was kind of the church that, if you're my vintage, you kind of grew up with. Well, I think he escaped that, so he was inclined to be more racy of the soil. And you can interpret this one in different ways. I think it's authentically Darby. It's called The Moor, and I came across it published in 1924. Again, there's this problem, different versions. This is the version I saw. And what you're hearing is the voice of the Moor, who is for hire. So one day in the autumn season, it being in the year 54, and spring approaching most pleasant, I took out my scythe for to mow. My handle was fair in its motion, my sandstone, my hook and my stone, and my blade as by Vulcan completed, when he from the heavens was thrown. I straight made my way to Tipperary, where I had been previously known, and halted at Meeting Lane Corner, that's Davis Street, and put my scythe for to show. Then a widow convenient to Bansha, observing me standing alone, she modestly made her appearance and said she had hay for to mow. She said, I'll hire you for a fortnight, and then if I like how you mow, I'll keep you for cutting the corn, and for thrashing I'll want you also. She showed me the meadow next morning and told me to cut it quite low. But before I had got to the headland, she said I was cutting too slow. I did my endeavours to please her, I being far away from my home. She said, if you work for me faithful, this farm will soon be your own. I saved all her hay from the storms and thrashed both her wheat and her oats. 'Twas then I demanded my wages and said I was on for the road. Ah, then, said she, don't forsake me and leave me in grief to bemoan. I'll keep you from going through hard labour. My farm on you I'll bestow. We went to the Scairt next morning, who tightened the knot on us both, and we lived quite contented and cosy near Bansha without want evermore. Thank you very much.
Walum couple folklore fe choma is vi Darby Sagailing. Padre go Fianachta, the professor of Irish in Maynooth, he said once, he was looking at a composition of a poem of Darby's. He said, this is one of the finest comic poems in the Irish language. Now that's a big statement. So it's important that we should have a look, at least, or a brief look at Darby's work in Irish. That's a big thing to say. And here's what he said, and it is easy to follow this little line. Tá sé an eiste sport is fearr sa Gaeilge. So I'm going to tell you something about that a little later. But first, as a starter, you might say, I'll take a very smaller poem. And it is set on the banks of the river Aherlow, a rare Costave na Harla. A rare Costave na Harla, the Cossack Urim Oigvan. I met a young woman. And he goes on and he tells us how he has a few words with her. And he's not too impressed because she's a liberated Bansha woman. And she's a bit forthright, and he doesn't like the way her mind is working. So he's forced in the end to say, Be shul, off with you. Tá trúcha farsing. Now the trúcha means the district. The country is wide. Tá trúcha farsing is yoir fir the gohin, and you'll get plenty men. So that shows the way she was going. So that puts him thinking, as often in male chauvinist literature, thinking of, as what he said, that's women for you. What was the politician that said? Albert Reynolds did that. So he started thinking then about all the trouble that came from women back down through history. And he starts with Solomon. And she had gashte behe bladrock dog Solomon gan fónamh. Now, gashta means snares. Behe, women. Bladderach, well, you know what bladderach means. She had gashta behe bladderach, dog Solomon gan fónamh. That destroyed Solomon. That's his first number one. Second one he comes up with is Dervergilla, who was Dermot MacMurray's wife, and she Rugil go Clor na Fola, so she brought the Normans to Ireland. And then he goes on and he goes further and he talks about Achilles, and then he talks about Talc, and then he talks about Samson, Kroger, and Delilah. So the poor girl is getting all this, and you'd expect to say, well, what is she going to say to that? So, spunky girl, she replies, wasn't there somebody called Turgatius one time? And Turgatius was a Viking chieftain. And Turgatius, in the time of Brian Boru, he was defeating all around him, especially in Leinster. And Waelauchlan, the king of Leinster, could do nothing against him. And Waelauchlan had a lovely daughter. And himself and his daughter said, we'll fix Turgatius. So he said to Turgatius, I'll give you my daughter. She was a good-looking girl, and Turgatius had an eye for good women. So she met Turgatius. She said, I'll make a date with you. Come to the island below in the lake, she says, and I'll meet you there. And not just myself, I'll also bring 15 beautiful maidens with me. And he said, oh, I'll come, and I'll bring 15 fine men with me. So he came to the island and he turned up, and she turned up with her 15 maidens, only they weren't maidens, they were men, and they had shaved off their beards, and immediately attacked Turgatius and his 15 men, and they slaughtered them. And so the Bansha girl's point was, there was a woman doing great work. Yeah. So he continued on anyway, and didn't impress him very much anyway. And I have so much stuff. Anyway, I have to get my glasses. Oh yes, I was saying about the woman. Nur dog Turgatius Marv is a corrid mar Morainlish. When she left Turgatius dead and all his friends with him. Now, he wasn't Darby. Darby was playing the straight man all through, very serious. And he says, Is lean to a spare van kalke, veheg tort uit dro hampla. Shame on you, fair lady, giving such bad example. Is veheg bride age shoshanakish, and you're enticing me, a learned scholar, con gnive ille na counsa, towards conduct most unseemly. And he advises her then, mind your soul, you might go to hell. But she's not impressed. She's a spunky woman, and she says, Ta fuckle de mar hakagum, I'm going by God's word. It's aunatamugokus, and I believe it. Na queer stray ir gossadoib. That's the lost sheep when they return. Go make kid fall to rompa. So he's still not giving in. and he advises her that she should be more or less going to confession. But anyway, she says she had one good try at trying to get him. So she says, "Na bíach éan grúi mer daigena na faraglom a storiel." Now, don't be cross with me, a story. It's not quidle fo mer shackendud, and don't drive me away from me. Ní mishe éan den tortson. I'm not that sort of a girl. And this, she says, "Tan tweed na sagwing. In a grand lonely place. It's ní brahim nakin or gonger, and I can't see anyone anywhere near us. So it's farmer who con maha say, na lewer shin id goidsin. And I think there's better things we could be doing than that old book you have in your hand." No good, doesn't work. And he's back, telling her to mind her soul. Shane and Druish, he says. Druish is sex or lust. Shane and Druish, keep away from sex. Marsagal dit vescata leshin glornib, if you're not afraid of going to hell. Fiach, he says, gor hurling losser treed, Sodom is Gomorrah. That's what brought the losser, fire and brimstone, on Sodom and Gomorrah. So he hopes that might work. But she says, "No, I'm not giving up this side business of mine. Ní rhaid had cuiha an Ashtisho. I'm not giving up. I'll never give up this way of life. An ada warhas moiga, as long as my youth lasts." As long as my youth lasts. And he still doesn't give in. And in the end, she has to say to him, "Even though you have all your learning, David Lane ta Diarmuid is marahel gomurort. In spite of all your learning, you're very badly wrong, and you're confused, and you're mistaken badly." Now, there's a new word, two new words I want to give you now. There's a word, flascock. It's a horrible sort of a man. And there's another word, cobok, an equally horrible man. And so these lying, treacherous, mean men. Now, she says, "Ein vok dead o Kenigshi, the only son of God that bought us. He's not a flascock, ni flascock e, nor cobok." In other words, he's not mean or lousy or lousy. Is ní éanach éine government, and he wouldn't condemn anyone for the garúil don courtson, for being obliging to a neighbour, of the garúil don courtson. And that's, she has the last word, so she can't shift him, so she gets the last word. That's an example of Darby's smaller poems now. I'll go on to the big one, the magnum opus, in a second. You notice, incidentally, that when he's writing in English, he's not half as earthy or as down to earth as this. For example, "The blooming milkmaid, pure and plain, with modest air and rustic gown, with a love sonnet soothes her swain in these cool shades of Thomastown." Now, that's a big difference between what he was talking about earlier on. Or even if you take, well, I haven't any example of love poetry from Darby, but if you take, for example, Cashel Moon, there's a lovely song, a love song from Cashel called Cashel Moon, and there's a verse in it, "She mo galar duach gan megos tu, arún mo cléb, I Cashel Moon is gan the labapuing ac an Clarbog Dale. It is my dear great sorrow that yourself and myself, oh my dear love, that we're not together in Cashel Moon, even if under us, the bed under us is only a bare deal board." Now that's the real Irish thing, as different to the blooming milkmaid and so on. By the way, what Desi was talking about, that song, There's a song in Irish very like that about a spalpeen that comes up from Waterford to Bansha. And I'd say it could possibly be based on that because he has adventures with Moira in Bansha. And he comes there. Either Diarmuid O'Riain is the name of that song. Anyway. Sorry? Oh, well, I'm not sure. I forgot. I can't remember the words now. But anyway, so if you don't mind, I'd say a little tiny bit about what O'Fenachta said was one of the finest poems in the Irish language. It's an attack, a satire on a rival poet. Of course, they hated each other. And there's a poem that the rival wrote back, but I'm not going to get as far as that, I imagine. But this poem, it's prose and poetry. So he starts with a bit of prose, and then he swings into the poetry. But he insults him and vilifies him left, right, and centre anyway. And it's based on the legal documents, especially the arrest warrants. In fact, the name of this thing is a barantus, but barantus is the English word warrant. And this is an arrest warrant for you see, the conventional arrest warrant said who the criminal was, what he looked like, where you might find him, and that you were authorised to arrest him and bring him before the magistrates. So this, actually, he starts very impressively with a blast of Latin. So he starts off, Quos ego sed motus prestat componere fluctus post mihi non simili poena commissi luetis. And that sounds very well. And then he goes straight into abusing this fella. And he starts, he starts with, I have a huge list of Irish insults here somewhere. Incidentally, he insulted Teigg's mother and father as well. He said that the father was hunted out of Cork, Blarney or Bandon in Cork, and then the mother, Sive was her name, she came up to County Limerick, to Pallasgreen, and she had Tig was only a child at the bottom of a bag, and flies buzzing around it. And she came then, and then he said, and of course, he found he had got brothers and sisters when she came to them, and nobody knows who they are or where they came from, because she was Sinanta, Silver, Thuguk, Tassie, Grover. She was nice and warm and accommodating and generous, and Tassie, hot I suppose, and Grover. It's near Yulted dinner for Bela Pisha go Creaca daughter. She never refused anyone a Mela Pisha. And you can guess what he means by a Mela Pisha. He never refused anyone, she never refused anyone a Mela Pisha as long as she lived. So he goes on like that. You see the things he said, there are other things he said which I can't quote you and shock you all. Okay. But he keeps going anyway like that. But by the way, he wasn't the only, this Tithe wasn't the only one that walked in his gardens. There was a fellow from Kerry walked in his gardens. He was, this Kerry man, he wasn't a Spalpeen. He came to Bansha to learn from this famous teacher that was in Bansha, Simon Cox. You don't make half enough glory of Simon Cox. He was one of the most famous teachers in Ireland at the time. And there's an article about him in the Tipperary Historical Journal, as it happens. But anyway, this man came anyway, and he walked on Darby's gardens, and he was satirised. Now, it's not clear whether it was Darby wrote it or whether it's another man called Henley that wrote it, but it sounds very like Darby. And he says, he had sort of a hump in him. Above his rump there is a hump that in him caused this great curvation. His walking prongs are like a tongues in constant oscillation. And then later on he says, if to this glen he comes again, I give my candid observation that his backside and lousy hide will get a wholesome flagellation. So, and in the end anyway, he says, bring him to me. I don't know, this core he calls him anyway. And the worst to having all those things written down. Anyway, that poem about the Kerryman, incidentally, you get it in Villanova University in Pennsylvania. Now, if you remember, the first time I ever heard of Villanova was when a great Tipperary runner got a scholarship to Villanova. Who was he?
O'Connor, Desi O'Connor.
No. The Ballincurry Hare, they called him. John Joe Barry was his name. And he went to Villanova. But anyway, if you want to see that poem, you have to go to Villanova.
I'll stop there when I'm there.
I think I'll stop.
We've had the academic, we've had the scholarly, so now we'll have the whimsical and the fanciful. I'll read you 3 poems, one expressing Darby's very deep affection for and appreciation of his beloved Ashgrove. That's called Shades of Ashgrove. Follow that with Fox Chase, which is a piece of fun, where Darby writes the story as if he were the fox being chased. And he really wants to mention all the places around Bansha, so the fox runs from Bansha to Galtee into Tip and ends up in Kilfeacle. Okay, and I'll conclude then with a lovely romantic piece so that you'll all know that Darby had a romantic soul, regardless of all the outrageous things that other people might say about him. I will develop his romanticism. Okay, so he excels himself with, he says, there's one great piece, and he says, exempt from all exaggeration. That is the understatement of the world. But anyway, here we go, Shades of Ashgrove. You bright Heliconian maidens, your favours I humbly implore. Vouchsafe to assist my endeavours, in eloquent measures to soar. My talents in truth are unequal, unless I'm inspired from above, to set forth in suitable phrases the beauties of verdant Ashgrove. Its valleys are fanned by the zephyrs, by genial and temperate breeze. The honey in quick distillation drips down from the fruit-bearing trees. The prolific mares they are grazing, and cattle full many a drove. The lambkins are wantonly playing along the sweet shades of Ashgrove. The Aherlow's clear crystal current, as nectar transparent and pure, glides gently in tardy meander, reluctantly joining the shore. Like the Nile's fertile inundations, the adjacent fair meadows improve, ensuring nature's rich vegetation along the sweet shades of Ashgrove. No pestilence, death, or contagion e'er haunted this fertilized place. The healthy and contented natives enjoy a full measure of peace. When Adam was banished from Eden in desolate regions to rove, he preferred, above all other places, to dwell in the shade of Ashgrove. Gay Flora with exquisite favour on her fields in all seasons bestows the violet, the lily and daisy, the tulip, carnation and rose. Here all sorts of flowers grow spontaneous in each sunny vale and alcove, in abundance, without cultivation, along the sweet shades of Ashgrove. 'Tis now I am come to a finish, kind neighbours, I bid you adieu. Exempt from all exaggeration, I give to my birthplace its due. If critics should scoff, I'm quite heedless, whether they disprove or approve. Come, toast off in copious libations, success to the shades of Ashgrove. So, who wouldn't want to live in Ashgrove after that? Okay, so the fox chase is a bit of fun where Darby gets to mention every place in the place. In Bansha Woods long time I lived, and all my generations, till that grand peer from Curramore disturbed my habitation. The cry of hound and horn sound from slumbers roused me early. In Father Cain's enclosed domain, I cleared with ease the paling. I sped away without delay in spite of all their schemings. The mill pond, sorry, skip that one. References in that I don't understand. Okay. So I cleared away without delay in spite of all their schemings. The deer park wall without a balk I vaulted most completely. Then in full view through Lismachew and the deep shore they chased me. But to my woe there was no boat to take me over safely. Now when I failed from them to take my way by navigation, I back again by Kappa Bridge repaired to Ballydavid. No ditch nor drain nor fence nor gate nor rapid stream restrained me, till with ears cocked while I stopped in Parson Cole's plantation. Through famed Ashgrove they then me drove, and back by Castle Mary. The Aherlow I waded o'er with vigour, strength and safety. Up Derry Glen through thick and thin I scampered, closely heated, and took a draught at Muskery Lock for my reanimation. Through bog and fen, though hunted still, to upper hills I hastened. To Galtee Moor my course I bore, and sat on Dawson's table. I entertained the pleasing hope that in those dreadful places my fell pursuers would be balked and falls prove surely fatal. But those fond thoughts soon came to naught, like all vain speculations. For down Free Sheen, hot on my heels, they came like hellish demons. At the church ford I crossed the stones, for courage never failed me. And such fine sport as then I showed will not be seen for ages. Above the pound I gained some ground, my spirits quite elated, and up Coach Road I slyly stole, for then my course seemed easy. Through Scalaheen by the fair green till I landed in Tipperary, pursued hot foot by the town brats and idle lounging tradesmen. So out by Crogue I slyly stole, in order to evade them. And 'twas my lot by Aisling trot ere night to reach Kilfeacle. Up at the moat, caught by the throat, poor Reynard he was seized on. Oh, noble lord, call off your dogs, or they will surely tear me. Till my last will and dying speech I'll make in all its bearing. My property I will divide between my next door neighbours, and Parson Cole, with a grey goose quill, will take down my dictation. So Darby saves us from the blood and gore of the kill, and instead the fox gets a chance to make his will. So there we go. Finish with Sweet Kate of Ardebreen. That's Townsland between Kilfeacle and Thomastown. Is that right, Mary Alice? Across the road from where you live? Okay. So this is Darby at his most sweetly romantic. And interestingly, he sets it on May Eve. And we've had mention already of Pishogues and May Eve, whereas Darby doesn't go that place. He says he keeps a May vigil with his lovely Kate of Ardebreen. The silver moon's enamoured beam steal softly through the night, to wanton with the winding stream and kiss reflected light. To courts be gone, heart-soothing sleep, where you've so seldom been, whilst I May's wakeful vigil keep with Kate of Arderbreen. The nymphs and swains expectant wait in primrose chaplets gay, till morn unbars her golden gate and gives the promised May. The nymphs and swains shall all declare the promised May, when seen, not half so fragrant, half so fair as Kate of Arderbreen. I'll change my tune to playful notes and rouse young nodding grove, till new wake birds distend their throats and hail the maid I love. At her approach the lark mistakes and quits the new dress green. Fond bird, 'tis not the morning breaks, 'tis Kate of Arderbreen. Thank you.
A Bansha Peeler went one night on duty and patrolling low, and met a goat upon the road and took her for a strolling no. When Bhotain had fixed, he sallied forth and caught her by the wisno, and then he swore a mighty oath, I'll send you off to prison, oh. Oh mercy, sir, the goat replied, they tell me their story, oh. I am no rogue, no ribbon man, no croppy Whig or Tory, oh. I'm guilty not of any crime, of petty or high treason, no. I'm sadly wanted at this time, for this is the milking season, no. It is in vain for to complain or give your tongue such bridle, oh. You're absent from your dwelling place, disorderly and idle, oh. Your hoary locks will not prevail, nor your sublime oration, no. You'll be transported by Peel's axe upon my information, no. No penal law did I transgress by deeds or combination, no. I have no certain place to rest, no home or habitation, no. But Bansha is my dwelling place, where I was bred and born, no. Descended from an honest race, that's all the trade I've learned, no. I will chastise your insolence and violent behaviour, oh. Well bound to Cashel you'll be sent to sign your condemnation, oh. From there to Cork you will be sent for speedy transportation, oh. This parish and this neighbourhood are peaceable and tranquil, oh. There's no disturbance here, thank God, and long may it continue so. I don't regard your oath a pin or sign from my committal, oh. My jury will be gentlemen and grant me my acquittal, oh. The consequence be what it will, a peeler's power I'll let you know. I'll hank if you at all events and march you off to Bridewell, oh. Oh sure you rogue you can't deny before the judge or jury, oh. Intimidation with your horns and threatening me with fury, oh. I make no doubt but you were drunk with whiskey, rum or brandy, oh. Or you wouldn't have such gallant spunk to be so bold or mandy, oh. You readily would let me pass if I had money handy, oh. To trade you to a pudgy glasses, then I'd be the dandy, oh. One evening I've laid out a Camden I straight to the county Tipperary. I was making the way to dig the potatoes and walk by the day with a farmer called Darby O'Riain. I asked him how far we were bound for to go, for the night it was dark and the cold wind did blow. My belly was empty, the spirits were low, and I got neither whiskey nor porter. Tilly out, out, tilly out, out, tilly out, 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 Tom. Tilly out, out, tilly out, out, tilly out, 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 Tom. Tilly out, out, Tom, tilly out, tilly out, out, Tom. Tilly out, out, tilly out. While the dirty old miser saddled his steer, up to Galbally Farmer he went off with speed. I followed behind, till my poor feet did bleed. We stopped when his howl horse was weaned. Tilly out, out, tilly out, out, tilly out, 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 Tom. Tilly out, out, tilly out, out, tilly out, 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 Tom. Tilly out, out, Tom, tilly out, Tom, tilly out, out, Tom. Tilly out, out, tilly out. As I remember when it was Michaelmas night, to a mighty fine supper he did me invite. Mug of sour milk, I was sickening as night, and it gave me the trotting disorder. The wet old potatoes, they sickened the cats. The barn where my bed was swarming with rats. There she was frightened, and Patrick the past, who frightened the lakes of the border. Tilly out, out, tilly out, out, tilly out, 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 Tom. Tilly out, out, tilly out, out, tilly out, 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 Tom. Tilly out, out, Tom, tilly out, Tom, tilly out, out, Tom. Tilly out, out, tilly out. I walked in Kilconnell, I walked in Kilmore, I walked in Arcady, Shanballymore, Palace, Nicker, and Solidmore, with farmers so decent and cheap. I walked in Tipperary, Rag and Rose Green, the Morrissey, Fickle, and across the valley. Dunkerton Town I never did see, and I met from the Galbally Farmer. Tilly out, out, tilly out, out, tilly out, 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 Tom. Tilly out, out, tilly out, out, tilly out, 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 Tom. Tilly out, out, Tom, tilly out, out, Tom. Tilly out, out, tilly out.
Well, first of all, as I stated earlier, this has been an overwhelming experience for me. And what I think is most important is this was all designed to be a remembrance, and we never expected anything like this. More importantly, I think it's important to remember that when my sister and I saw the condition of that headstone, we decided we were going to fix it. And my sister said, well, wait a second, maybe the family might want to get involved. And my sister had a list of 32 Grogan emails. And we sent out an email to 32 Grogans saying that we were going to restore it, did anyone want to make a donation. 90+% responded. In fact, almost 100% if you consider the families. But more importantly, we did this as a personal gesture. We did this from our hearts. We did it from our family. We did it from our experience, from our heritage. If we hadn't have done it, we wouldn't be here tonight. If that headstone had to have been refinished, Mary Alice and her team and the Heritage Association wouldn't have known anything. Because to be honest, when it was done, people said, who's doing it? Because nobody from the village was doing it. Nobody had authorized it. They contacted Wally Costigan, and Wally said, these Yanks from America, I don't know who they are. But that's how it came about. So the whole idea here is history. The whole idea is family. The whole idea is heritage. And never forgetting where we come from. Never forgetting who our family is, who they were, and who they'll be in the future. I thank you from my heart. I thank you from every Grogan that participated in making that happen, that this accident became what it did tonight. Thank you.